What I'm about to reveal to you is one of the most horrifying acts of cruelty ever committed by a Roman emperor. A crime so monstrous that even ancient historians who witnessed countless atrocities struggled to record it. In the year 211 AD, Emperor Caracalla didn't just murder his younger brother Geta in their mother's arms. What he did afterward to his brother's pregnant wife Julia defied every notion of human decency and familial bond. He dragged her to the Colosseum, not as a spectator, but as a witness to an act of pure evil that would haunt Roman history forever. He forced this pregnant woman to watch as executioners ripped her unborn child from her womb and fed the living infant to starving wild dogs in the arena. The screams of the child mixed with the snarls of beasts, while Caracalla stood beside her, ensuring she watched every moment. But the horror didn't end there. After destroying her family and her unborn child, he made her his concubine, forcing her into his bed while the blood of her husband and child was still fresh. This wasn't madness. This was calculated cruelty designed to erase his brother's legacy and demonstrate absolute power. For centuries, this story was suppressed, hidden in fragments of ancient texts that scholars deemed too disturbing to translate fully. Today we're going to uncover exactly what happened in those dark days of 211 AD, how one man's paranoia and lust for power led to an unthinkable atrocity, and why this story was deliberately erased from mainstream historical accounts. But first, we need to understand the man who would commit such evil, and the family dynamics that created Rome's bloodiest imperial succession. Rome, in the early 3rd century, was an empire in crisis. The golden age of the 5 good emperors had ended decades earlier, replaced by military strongmen who seized power through violence and held it through terror. Into this world were born 2 brothers who would become the most infamous sibling rivals in Roman history. Lucius Septimius Bassianus, later known as Caracalla, and Publius Septimius Geta. Their father, Septimius Severus, had fought his way to the Purple Throne through civil war, defeating rival claimants and establishing the Severan Dynasty in 193 AD. He was a military emperor, a man from North Africa who understood that power in Rome came from the legions, not the Senate. His wife, Julia Domna, was a brilliant and ambitious Syrian woman from a family of hereditary priests. Educated in philosophy and politics, determined that her sons would rule the known world. Caracalla was born in 188 AD in Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, in Gaul, during his father's military campaigns. From childhood, he showed signs of a violent and unstable temperament. Ancient historians describe a boy who tortured animals, attacked playmates, and flew into rages at the slightest provocation. His father, rather than correcting these tendencies, encouraged them, believing aggression was necessary for an emperor who would command armies. Geta was born a year later, in 189 AD, in Rome itself. Unlike his older brother, Geta showed intellectual curiosity, skill in rhetoric, and a more measured temperament. Their mother, Julia Domna, particularly favored Geta, seeing in him the refinement and political acumen she valued. This maternal preference would prove fatal. The brothers were raised in an environment of constant military campaign and political intrigue. Their father dragged them across the empire, from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Britain, always at war, always fighting to maintain control. The boys were educated by the finest tutors Rome could provide, learning Greek, Latin, philosophy, military strategy, and the arts of governance. But they were also learning a darker lesson, that power was everything, and mercy was weakness. As they grew into young men, the contrast between them became more pronounced. Caracalla, named for the Gallic hooded cloak he popularized, was powerfully built, a natural soldier who preferred the company of legionaries to senators. He practiced with weapons constantly, joined military exercises, and cultivated an image as a man of the people and the army. Geta, by contrast, was more slender, more refined, more interested in administration and the complexities of governing a vast empire.
He surrounded himself with intellectuals and showed genuine interest in the welfare of Rome's provinces. The tension between the brothers erupted into open hatred during their father's final campaign in Britain, where Septimius Severus sought to conquer Caledonia, the unconquered lands of modern Scotland. The emperor was dying, slowly, of gout and disease, and both sons knew succession was imminent. Caracalla, as the elder, expected to inherit the throne alone. Geta, backed by their mother, Julia Domna, and several influential advisors, argued for co-rule. The brothers began openly arguing in their father's presence, each commanding different legions, each building separate networks of loyal officers and officials. On his deathbed in York, in February 211 AD, Septimius Severus made a decision that would doom thousands. He declared that both sons would rule as co-emperors, sharing power equally, believing this would prevent civil war. His last recorded words to them were, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." It was advice that would be catastrophically misinterpreted. The old emperor died, and his sons immediately returned to Rome with his ashes, but their mutual hatred had grown beyond any possibility of cooperation. They divided the imperial palace literally in half, each brother taking separate wings, building walls to separate their quarters, posting their own guards, and refusing to eat together for fear of poisoning. Rome now had two emperors who despised each other, each commanding loyal troops, each plotting the other's destruction. The Senate and the people watched in horror as the empire teetered on the edge of civil war. Julia Domna, their mother, desperately tried to mediate between her sons, shuttling between their separated palace wings, attempting to forge compromise, but both brothers refused reconciliation. Some ancient sources suggest that the brothers seriously discussed dividing the entire empire, with Caracalla taking the western provinces and Geta the eastern. But their mother blocked this plan, knowing it would lead to immediate war and the destruction of everything their father had built. During this period of joint rule, which lasted less than a year, Geta married a woman named Julia, a member of the extended imperial family. The sources are unclear about her exact lineage, but she was likely a cousin or distant relative, chosen to strengthen dynastic ties. She was young, educated, and by all accounts deeply in love with her husband. Within months of their marriage, she became pregnant, carrying what would be the next generation of the Severan dynasty. This pregnancy would seal her fate. Caracalla saw his brother's unborn child as a future rival, a potential claimant to the throne who could rally supporters decades hence. In his paranoid mind, eliminating Geta wasn't enough. The entire bloodline needed to be erased. In December of 211 AD, Caracalla made his move. He approached his mother Julia Domna with a desperate plea. He claimed he wanted to reconcile with his brother, to end the bitter feud tearing apart their family and the empire. He asked his mother to arrange a meeting in her private apartments, neutral ground where both brothers could meet without guards, without advisors, just family, attempting to heal old wounds.
Julia Domna, exhausted from months of failed mediation, desperate to prevent civil war, agreed. She invited both sons to her chambers on December 26, 211 AD, hoping that maternal authority could finally end the conflict. The ancient historian Cassius Dio, who lived through this period and interviewed witnesses, describes what happened next in detail that still chills readers 18 centuries later. Geta arrived first at his mother's apartments, unarmed as protocol required in the Empress's presence. Julia Domna embraced her younger son, perhaps sensing this meeting would be momentous. Caracalla arrived moments later, and the two brothers stood facing each other in their mother's receiving room, the tension thick enough to choke on. Julia Domna began speaking, urging reconciliation, reminding them they were brothers, sons of the same great father, co-rulers of the greatest empire the world had known. She pleaded with them to embrace, to swear peace before the gods and before her. For a moment it seemed possible. Geta took a step forward, perhaps willing to try once more. That's when Caracalla gave the signal. Praetorian centurions loyal to Caracalla, hidden in the adjacent rooms, burst through the doorways with drawn swords. Geta realized instantly he'd been betrayed. He ran to his mother, throwing himself into her arms, begging her to protect him. Julia Domna tried desperately to shield her younger son with her own body, screaming at Caracalla to stop, ordering the guards to stand down. But Caracalla personally joined the attack. He drew his own sword and began stabbing his brother while Geta clutched their mother. The ancient sources emphasize the horror of this moment. A son murdering his brother in their mother's embrace. The mother's screams mixing with the dying cries of her child, blood soaking her imperial robes. Geta suffered multiple wounds, the sword strikes hitting not just him but also his mother as she tried to shield him. When Geta finally collapsed, dead or dying, at his mother's feet, Caracalla ordered his guards to drag the body away. Julia Domna was left standing in her own apartments, covered in the blood of both her sons, traumatized beyond words. But Caracalla wasn't finished, not even close. The murder of Geta was only the beginning of a purge that would consume thousands. Caracalla immediately ran from his mother's chambers to the Praetorian barracks, claiming that he had narrowly escaped an assassination attempt by his brother, that he had killed Geta in self-defense. He threw himself on the mercy of the Praetorian Guard, promising them massive bonuses if they would protect him from his brother's conspirators. The soldiers, always loyal to whoever paid best, accepted his story and proclaimed him sole emperor. What followed was one of the bloodiest purges in Roman history. Over the next few days and weeks, Caracalla ordered the execution of everyone associated with Geta. Ancient sources claim that 20,000 people were killed. This included Geta's advisors, friends, servants, guards, political supporters, and anyone who had spoken favorably of him. Even distinguished senators and military officers, who had merely been civil to Geta, were dragged from their homes and executed without trial. Caracalla personally drew up lists of victims, his paranoia and rage feeding on themselves. He ordered that Geta's name be erased from all public inscriptions, a practice called damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Stonemasons across the empire worked to chisel his brother's name off monuments. Coins were melted down. Statues were destroyed. It was as if Geta had never existed. But for Caracalla, even this wasn't enough. There remained one living link to his brother: Julia, Geta's pregnant wife. What happened next represents a level of cruelty that shocked even Rome's jaded population, accustomed as they were to imperial violence. Julia had gone into hiding immediately after Geta's murder, protected by loyal servants who moved her between safe houses in Rome, knowing that as Geta's widow and the carrier of his child, she was in mortal danger. For several weeks, she evaded Caracalla's increasingly frantic searches, but betrayal was inevitable. Someone revealed her location, likely motivated by the enormous reward Caracalla offered, or by fear of being associated with harboring the emperor's enemy. Praetorian guardsmen arrested her in the middle of the night, dragging her from her hiding place. She was not executed immediately. That would have been too merciful for Caracalla's purposes. Instead, she was brought to the imperial palace and held in custody. Ancient sources suggest she was held for several days while Caracalla planned something special, something that would send a message to anyone who might challenge him. On a cold January morning in 212 AD, Julia was dragged from her cell. She was approximately 6 months pregnant by this point, her condition obvious to everyone who saw her. Guards transported her not to an execution ground, but to the Colosseum itself, the great amphitheater where Rome celebrated violence as entertainment. But the arena was not filled with spectators that day. Caracalla had ordered it cleared, except for select witnesses, palace officials, and Praetorian officers, whose loyalty he wanted to test and bind through shared participation in atrocity. Julia was brought into the arena floor, that blood-soaked sand where countless gladiators, criminals, and wild animals had died for public amusement. She must have been terrified, confused, perhaps still hoping that some mercy might be shown, some recognition of her imperial status, her pregnancy, her basic humanity. Caracalla appeared in the imperial box, the elevated seating area where emperors watched the games. He wanted her to see him, to know who orchestrated what would happen next. Then he gave orders that revealed the full depths of his depravity. Palace physicians were brought into the arena, along with executioners and beast handlers. Julia was forcibly restrained by guards, held down on the arena sand. The physicians, under direct orders from the emperor, performed a crude Caesarean section on her while she was fully conscious. The ancient sources don't detail the exact procedure, likely because the writers themselves were horrified and chose euphemistic language. But the essential fact is undeniable. They cut open her abdomen and removed her living child, a late-term fetus that may or may not have been viable outside the womb. What happened next is the detail that made even hardened Roman historians struggle to record it. The infant, whether already dead from the procedure or still clinging to life, was thrown to wild dogs that had been deliberately starved for days. Beast handlers released the animals into the arena, and Julia was forced to watch as the dogs tore apart her child. The ancient historian Herodian, writing a few decades later, says that Julia's screams could be heard throughout the surrounding neighborhoods, a sound that witnesses said haunted them for the rest of their lives. Caracalla remained in the imperial box throughout, watching, ensuring that Julia saw everything, that she understood this was punishment for being married to his brother, for carrying the bloodline he wanted to erase, for representing a future he couldn't control. But the horror still wasn't finished. Julia survived the procedure, likely because the physicians had been ordered to keep her alive. She was returned to the palace, her body mutilated, her child murdered before her eyes, her husband dead, everything taken from her. A merciful emperor would have granted her death at this point, allowing her to join her husband and child.
But Caracalla was not merciful. In an act that added psychological torture to physical brutality, he made Julia his concubine. The ancient sources are explicit about this, though they clearly struggle with the implications.
Caracalla forced his brother's widow, the woman he had so horrifically brutalized, into his own bed. This wasn't about desire or even political marriage. This was about domination, about demonstrating total power, about inflicting maximum psychological damage. It was about forcing her to submit to the man who had murdered her husband, killed her child in the most horrific manner imaginable, and destroyed her entire world. Some historians have questioned whether this detail is exaggerated or misunderstood, whether perhaps Caracalla merely kept her imprisoned or married her off to one of his supporters. But multiple independent sources confirm the essential fact. Herodian states it directly. Cassius Dio, though writing somewhat later, confirms it from eyewitness accounts. Even Caracalla's admiring biographers, who try to excuse or minimize his other crimes, admit this one with evident discomfort. The ancient world, for all its brutality, recognized this as exceptional depravity. Julia lived in this nightmare for several years. She was kept in the imperial palace, accessible to Caracalla when he wanted her, a living trophy of his victory over his brother. She was denied the right to mourn publicly, denied the right to suicide, which Roman culture considered an honorable escape from unbearable circumstances, denied even the comfort of obscurity. She was displayed at public events, forced to maintain the appearance of an imperial consort, all while everyone in Rome knew what had been done to her. The psychological torture may have been worse than the physical. Ancient sources provide few details about these years of her captivity, likely because Julia herself refused to speak about them to anyone, and those who witnessed her suffering found it too disturbing to record. We know she survived until at least 215 AD because there are references to her presence at certain imperial ceremonies. After that date, she disappears from the historical record entirely. Most historians assume she was eventually killed, possibly when Caracalla tired of her or felt her presence was no longer useful as a symbol of his triumph. Some sources suggest she may have died by suicide, finally finding an opportunity to escape her tormentor. Others suggest disease or violence claimed her. The truth is, we don't know. Her death, like so much of her suffering, was deemed too disturbing or too shameful to record in detail. During these same years, Caracalla's rule became increasingly tyrannical and erratic. He spent most of his time with the army, launching expensive military campaigns, particularly against the Parthian Empire in the east. He granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 AD, a reform that sounds progressive until you understand his motivation was primarily to expand the tax base to pay for his military spending. He commissioned the massive baths of Caracalla in Rome, one of the ancient world's most impressive architectural achievements, but funded it through confiscations and executions of wealthy Romans accused of treason. He murdered his own Praetorian prefect Papinian, one of Rome's greatest jurists, for refusing to justify Geta's murder legally. He executed countless others on the slightest suspicion or whim. Ancient sources paint him as increasingly paranoid, prone to violent rages, and possibly suffering from some form of mental illness that expressed itself through sadistic cruelty. His relationship with his mother, Julia Domna, became complicated and disturbing. She remained at court, still holding the title of Augusta, still involved in imperial administration. But the ancient sources hint at profound psychological trauma. She had witnessed one son murder another in her arms, had seen her grandson murdered in the arena, had watched her daughter-in-law reduced to a broken concubine,
Some sources suggest Julia Domna attempted suicide multiple times, but was prevented by palace guards.
Others suggest she withdrew into scholarship and philosophy, surrounding herself with intellectuals, trying to find meaning or at least distraction from the horrors she had witnessed and been powerless to prevent. Caracalla's obsession with Alexander the Great intensified during these years, becoming almost a delusion. He dressed like Alexander, imitated his military tactics, and declared himself a reincarnation of the Macedonian conqueror. He visited Alexandria in Egypt in 215 AD, ostensibly to honor Alexander's memory, but while there, he ordered a massacre of the city's young men because he believed they had mocked him. Thousands died. The incident reveals how completely Caracalla had embraced tyranny and mass murder as tools of rule. By 217 AD, even his own supporters had grown to fear and hate him. His military campaigns had stalled, his spending had exhausted the treasury, and his unpredictable violence meant no one felt safe. A conspiracy formed among his closest officers, including the new Praetorian prefect Macrinus, who had served Caracalla loyally, but had been warned that his name appeared on the emperor's latest list of suspected traitors. On April 8, 217 AD, while traveling between Edessa and Karhai in modern-day Turkey during his Parthian campaign, Caracalla stopped to urinate by the roadside. While he was momentarily alone and vulnerable, a soldier named Julius Martialis, who had a personal grudge against the emperor, approached and stabbed him to death. The assassination was quick and brutal. The most powerful man in the world died in the dirt beside a road, murdered by a common soldier. He was 29 years old and had ruled for 6 years. Macrinus immediately proclaimed himself emperor, claiming to discover the conspiracy only after the assassination. The army, though they had loved Caracalla's generosity with bonuses and his willingness to share their hardships, did not mourn his death deeply. The Senate in Rome certainly didn't mourn him, and the common people, who had suffered under his taxation and witnessed his cruelty, felt relief more than grief. Julius Martialis, the assassin, was killed immediately by Caracalla's bodyguards, but he died satisfied that he had ended a tyrant's reign. When news reached Rome, Julia Domna was initially reported to have shown no reaction, her face like stone, whatever emotions she felt buried too deep after years of trauma. Within weeks, she received word that Macrinus had issued orders for her exile from the palace. The new emperor wanted no remnants of the Severan dynasty alive to challenge his rule. For Julia Domna, this was apparently the final breaking point. Rather than accept exile, rather than continue living with the memories of what she had witnessed and been powerless to prevent, she chose death. Ancient sources report that she stopped eating, starving herself to death over the course of several weeks. Some sources suggest she may have had cancer and used the political chaos as an opportunity to end her suffering. Either way, Julia Domna died in Antioch in Syria, her homeland, a few months after her son's assassination. She was buried with imperial honors, one of the most intelligent and capable women to ever serve as Roman empress, destroyed by the violence of the men around her. With both Caracalla and Julia Domna dead, the truth about what had happened to Geta's wife Julia began to emerge more fully. The conspiracy of silence that had surrounded her suffering broke down. Former palace servants, guards, and officials who had witnessed events began talking, sharing their testimonies with historians and each other. The story spread throughout the empire, becoming one of those dark tales that people told in hushed voices, almost unable to believe that a human being, let alone an emperor, could commit such acts. The historical record of these events comes to us through several sources, each with their own perspective and potential bias. Cassius Dio, a Roman senator and historian who lived through the Severan dynasty, wrote his Roman History in the decades following these events. He had access to eyewitnesses and official records. His account is generally considered reliable, though he clearly despised Caracalla and may have emphasized the emperor's worst qualities. Herodian, writing around the same time, provides a more dramatic narrative with specific details about the arena atrocity. Some historians question whether Herodian sometimes prioritized dramatic storytelling over strict accuracy, but his account aligns with other sources on essential facts. The Historia Augusta, a much later and less reliable collection of imperial biographies, also mentions these events, but with legendary embellishments that make it difficult to separate fact from fiction. Early Christian writers, including Tertullian and later Eusebius, referenced Caracalla's cruelty as evidence of pagan Roman depravity, though their accounts are colored by religious perspective. The Jewish historian and tradition also preserved stories of Caracalla's reign, as Jewish communities suffered under his taxation and occasional persecution. Modern historians have worked to cross-reference these sources, archaeological evidence, and contemporary inscriptions to reconstruct what actually happened. The consensus is that while specific details may vary between accounts, the core narrative is historically sound. Caracalla did murder his brother Geta in their mother's arms. He did conduct a massive purge of Geta's supporters. He did commit horrific acts against Geta's pregnant wife Julia. The exact details of how her child was killed, whether it was precisely as described or somewhat different, may be debated, but that something extraordinarily cruel happened to her is not in serious historical doubt. The psychological profile of Caracalla that emerges from these sources is of a deeply disturbed individual, whose mental illness or personality disorder was amplified by absolute power. Modern psychologists who have analyzed historical accounts suggest possible diagnoses ranging from paranoid personality disorder to psychopathy to traumatic brain injury from his numerous military campaigns. But diagnosis across 2 millennia is speculative at best. What we can say with confidence is that Caracalla exhibited a pattern of behavior that combined paranoia, impulsive violence, lack of empathy, and sadistic cruelty, all enabled by absolute power that faced no meaningful constraints. The question naturally arises, how could this happen? How could an emperor commit such acts and remain in power for years afterward? The answer lies in the nature of Roman imperial power in the 3rd century. By this period, the emperor's authority rested almost entirely on the army's loyalty. The Senate had been reduced to a rubber stamp. The people had no real political power, and the Praetorian Guard served whoever paid them best. As long as Caracalla kept the legions happy with bonuses, victories, and shared hardships, they didn't care what he did to civilians in Rome. The army loved him because he lived with them, ate their food, marched with them, and fought alongside them. To the soldiers, he was one of them, and his personal cruelty to aristocrats and family members didn't affect their loyalty. The broader Roman population lived in fear. Caracalla's network of spies and informers meant that criticizing the emperor could result in immediate execution. The mass purge following Geta's death had sent a clear message: no one was safe from the emperor's wrath. So people stayed silent, kept their heads down, and waited for the nightmare to end. This pattern of tyranny, sustained by military loyalty and civilian fear, would repeat throughout the 3rd century crisis, as emperor after emperor seized power through violence and ruled through terror. The specific atrocities committed by Caracalla were exceptional even for this brutal period, but the system that enabled them was entirely typical. The fate of Geta's wife, Julia, also reveals something about the particular vulnerability of women in these power struggles. In Roman imperial politics, women were often used as pawns, married off to cement alliances, murdered to prevent dynastic complications, or kept alive as symbols of conquest. Julia experienced perhaps the worst combination of these possibilities. Her pregnancy made her a threat that needed to be eliminated, but her connection to Geta made her useful as a symbol of Caracalla's total victory. Her forced concubinage served to demonstrate that Caracalla had not just defeated his brother politically, but had claimed everything that belonged to him, including his wife, in the most degrading manner possible. This weaponization of sexual violence against women was not unique to Caracalla, but appeared throughout ancient warfare and political conflict. What made this case exceptional was the systematic, calculated nature of it, and the specific cruelty of forcing her to witness her child's death before subjecting her to ongoing sexual slavery. The legacy of Caracalla's crimes extended far beyond his lifetime. For generations, his name became synonymous with fratricidal betrayal and psychopathic cruelty. Later emperors used Caracalla as an example of how not to rule, though many of them committed comparable atrocities themselves. The Severan dynasty, which had briefly stabilized the empire after the chaos of the late 2nd century, was discredited by Caracalla's crimes and collapsed within a few years of his death. The Roman Empire entered the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of civil war, economic collapse, invasion, and near-total disintegration. While Caracalla's reign didn't solely cause this crisis, it contributed to the breakdown of institutional legitimacy and the normalization of extreme violence as a political tool. The story of what happened to Geta's wife Julia was deliberately suppressed and minimized in later Roman histories. It was simply too disturbing, too shameful, too incomprehensible for Roman writers who wanted to maintain some vision of Roman dignity and civilization. The accounts that do survive are often euphemistic or fragmentary, requiring careful reading between the lines to understand what actually happened. This suppression means that many general histories of Rome mention Caracalla's murder of Geta, but skip over or minimize what happened afterward. The full horror remained hidden in specialist academic sources, in footnotes, in classical texts that most people never read. Only in recent decades have historians begun to fully acknowledge and analyze these events, partly because modern sensitivity to sexual violence has made us more willing to recognize and name what ancient sources often obscured with euphemism. Comparing Caracalla's atrocities to other historical cases of extreme political violence reveals disturbing patterns. The systematic use of sexual violence against female relatives of political enemies appears across cultures and centuries. The public spectacle of cruelty, designed to terrorize populations into submission, is a constant feature of tyrannical rule. The personality profile of the paranoid tyrant who sees threats everywhere and responds with disproportionate violence appears again and again throughout history. Caracalla was not unique in his cruelty, but he represents an extreme example of what happens when absolute power combines with mental instability and lack of accountability. The specific detail of forcing a mother to watch her child killed in such a manner finds parallels in other historical atrocities. Medieval executions sometimes included similar elements of forced witnessing and desecration of family bonds. Modern genocides and ethnic cleansings have included systematic sexual violence and forced observation of family members being murdered. The human capacity for cruelty, particularly when empowered by political authority and motivated by identity conflicts, appears to have few limits. What lessons can we draw from this dark history? First, that absolute power without accountability inevitably leads to atrocity. Caracalla faced no institutional checks on his authority. The Senate couldn't stop him. The law didn't constrain him. And public opinion was irrelevant to him. Once Geta was dead, and the Praetorian Guard was bought off, nothing prevented Caracalla from acting on his worst impulses. Modern systems of divided power, rule of law, and democratic accountability exist specifically to prevent such scenarios, though they don't always succeed. Second, that violence escalates when left unchecked. Caracalla began with political murders of his brother's supporters, escalated to horrific personal violence against his brother's wife, and ended by massacring entire cities. Each atrocity made the next one easier, both psychologically and practically. He faced no consequences for his crimes, so he committed greater crimes. This pattern of escalating violence appears in many historical tyrants and suggests the importance of early intervention and accountability before behavior spirals completely out of control. Third, that trauma and violence perpetuate themselves across generations. Caracalla was raised in an environment of constant warfare, political violence, and moral flexibility. His father had killed his way to power and taught his sons that strength and ruthlessness were the only virtues that mattered. Julia Domna, traumatized by witnessing her son's murder and grandson's death, survived, but at tremendous psychological cost. The violence of one generation created the conditions for the violence of the next. Breaking such cycles requires conscious effort and institutional structures that prevent violence from being normalized. Fourth, that historical memory matters. The deliberate suppression of these events by later Roman historians meant that valuable lessons about the nature of tyranny and the vulnerability of victims were lost. Only by recovering and honestly examining such histories can we understand the full range of human behavior and hopefully recognize warning signs before atrocities occur. The discomfort we feel reading about what happened to Julia is appropriate and necessary. That discomfort should motivate us to prevent similar suffering, not to look away from historical truth. Fifth, that the victims deserve to be remembered. Geta's wife Julia has largely been forgotten by history. We don't even know her full name with certainty. Her suffering was so extreme that historians couldn't bring themselves to document it fully. But she was a real person who experienced unimaginable horror. Remembering her, speaking her story, acknowledging what was done to her is a form of justice, however inadequate and belated. It resists the historical erasure that perpetrators like Caracalla tried to impose. In examining this history, we must resist both the temptation to dismiss it as exaggerated legend and the temptation to treat it as entertainment. These were real events that happened to real people. The horror should not be sensationalized, but neither should it be minimized. The ancient sources, for all their flaws and biases, preserve testimony of witnesses who saw these things and felt compelled to record them despite their discomfort. We owe it to those witnesses and to the victims to take their accounts seriously. The story also raises profound questions about human nature. How much of Caracalla's cruelty resulted from individual psychology versus the corrupting influence of power? Could any person with absolute authority and no accountability eventually commit such acts? Or does it require a particular personality predisposition? History suggests that while not every person with power becomes a monster,
Power itself creates opportunities and temptations for cruelty that few can resist entirely. The concentration of power in a single individual without institutional checks remains one of the most dangerous political configurations human societies can create. Modern parallels exist, though we should be careful about direct comparisons across such different contexts. Authoritarian regimes in the 20th and 21st centuries have committed atrocities that echo elements of Caracalla's crimes. Political purges, sexual violence as a weapon of terror, forced witnessing of family members' deaths, and the complete dehumanization of victims. While technology and ideology differ, the underlying dynamics of tyrannical power remain disturbingly consistent.
Recognizing these patterns may help societies resist the emergence of such regimes and hold perpetrators accountable before violence escalates to the extremes Caracalla reached. For students of Roman history specifically, Caracalla's reign marks a turning point. He represents the end of any pretense that the Roman Empire was governed by law, tradition, or civic virtue. After Caracalla, it became undeniable that imperial power rested solely on military force and personal authority. This realization contributed to the crisis of the 3rd century, as military strongman after military strongman seized power through violence, ruled briefly, and was overthrown or assassinated. The stability of the earlier principate was gone, replaced by chaos that would eventually require completely restructuring the empire under Diocletian and Constantine. Caracalla's crimes thus had long-term structural consequences beyond their immediate horror. The archaeological record provides some supporting evidence for these events, though much remains buried or destroyed. Excavations of the imperial palace complex on the Palatine Hill have revealed the complex layout that ancient sources describe, with separate wings that could have housed the rival brothers. The Colosseum's underground chambers and arena floor, where Julia's child was killed, have been extensively studied, and we know how beast games were conducted. Contemporary coins and inscriptions document the damnatio memoriae against Geta, with his name deliberately erased. Medical understanding of ancient surgical procedures confirms that crude cesarean sections, though rarely survived by the mother, were within the technical capability of Roman physicians. All of this corroborates the plausibility of the ancient accounts, even if we can't definitively prove every detail. Recent scholarly work has also examined this history through the lens of trauma studies and gender analysis. Historians have begun to recognize that traditional Roman history, written almost exclusively by and about elite men, systematically minimized or ignored violence against women unless it served particular narrative purposes. The experiences of women like Julia, even imperial women, were considered less historically significant than military campaigns and political maneuvering. Modern scholarship tries to correct this bias by taking seriously the female victims of political violence and analyzing how gender shaped both vulnerability and historical memory. This approach helps us better understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and why it was remembered in particular ways. The story also illuminates the limited agency of women in Roman imperial families. Julia Domna, despite her intelligence, education, and political skill, couldn't prevent her sons from destroying each other. Geta's wife Julia, despite her imperial status, had no power to protect herself or her child from Caracalla's violence. Their experiences remind us that even privileged women in the ancient world lived in fundamentally patriarchal structures where they could be deployed as political pawns, reproductive resources, or targets of male violence with little ability to resist. This doesn't mean ancient women were purely passive victims without any agency, but it does mean their agency was severely constrained by legal, social, and physical power differentials that men could and did exploit. Understanding these structural conditions helps us interpret individual stories within their proper context, rather than judging historical figures by anachronistic standards. As we reach the end of this investigation into one of history's darkest chapters, we're left with uncomfortable truths about human nature and political power. Caracalla's cruelty was not the result of one bad individual, though he certainly was a bad individual. It emerged from a political system that concentrated unlimited power in one person, a military culture that valued violence above all other virtues, a family dynamic poisoned by rivalry and ambition, and a social structure that systematically devalued certain categories of human beings. All of these factors combined to create conditions where extraordinary atrocity became not just possible, but almost inevitable. The victims, particularly Geta and his wife Julia, deserve to be remembered not just as footnotes to Caracalla's biography, but as individuals whose suffering mattered, whose humanity was real, and whose stories teach us about the costs of tyranny. Their deaths accomplished nothing positive. They didn't stabilize the empire or benefit anyone. They were simply the products of one man's paranoia, cruelty, and unlimited power. That such things could happen in one of history's most advanced civilizations should make us skeptical of any claim that human progress makes us immune to barbarism. The capacity for both extraordinary good and extraordinary evil exists in every human culture and every historical period. What varies is the institutional and cultural constraints that channel those capacities in one direction or another. The suppression and later recovery of this history also teaches us about the politics of historical memory. What we choose to remember and forget, to emphasize and minimize, shapes our understanding of human possibilities and limits. The fact that these events were deliberately obscured by ancient historians because they were too shameful or disturbing meant that important lessons went unlearned. Modern historians' recovery and honest examination of such dark histories, however uncomfortable, serves the vital purpose of expanding our understanding of what humans are capable of, and hopefully making us more vigilant against such possibilities in our own time. In sharing this history, the goal is not to sensationalize ancient cruelty or to provide entertainment through others' suffering. The goal is to bear witness, to remember victims who were almost forgotten, to understand the dynamics that enable such atrocities, and to recognize patterns that might help prevent similar horrors in the future. History at its best serves as both memorial and warning. The story of Caracalla, Geta, and Julia fulfills both purposes. It memorializes real people who suffered and died under tyranny, and it warns us about the dangers of concentrated power, unchecked violence, and the human capacity for cruelty when all constraints are removed. This history should make us appreciate political systems that limit power, legal structures that protect the vulnerable, and cultural values that recognize the humanity of all people. These are not natural or inevitable features of human society, but hard-won achievements that require constant defense. The ancient Romans, for all their accomplishments, failed to create such systems. And the result was emperors like Caracalla, who could commit atrocities with impunity. We have the opportunity to learn from their failures, to build better systems, to cultivate better values, and to remember that the victims of history were real people whose suffering demands our acknowledgement and our commitment to prevent such things from happening again. As you reflect on this dark chapter of Roman history, consider what it reveals about power and its corruption. Think about the victims whose names we barely know, but whose suffering we can still feel across 2 millennia. Ask yourself what institutional and cultural safeguards your own society has against such tyranny, and whether they're sufficient. History doesn't repeat exactly, but patterns recur. The questions raised by Caracalla's reign remain relevant today. How do we prevent the concentration of power that enables atrocity? How do we protect vulnerable populations from predatory authority? How do we remember victims honestly without exploiting their suffering? How do we acknowledge human capacity for evil without becoming cynical about human possibilities? These questions have no easy answers, but engaging with them seriously is part of what it means to learn from history, rather than just consuming it as entertainment. The dead can teach the living, but only if we listen to their stories with both open minds and critical thinking. If we honor their memory by refusing to let their suffering be forgotten or repeated.